Hello.
Hello.
Oh, it's set to be recorded and transcribed automatically.
Which means it starts now.
Wow, new tech. Cat, just learned about a possibility I didn't know existed, which is that recording can start automatically,
Oh, I didn't know that either.
right?
I think
Is
it,
our
it can
tech predicting our needs?
it can be set up when you set the meeting, I think.
Sweet.
Taylor, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay.
Do you want me to be hearing more?
No, I just have been having audio problems and video problems with my computer the whole day. So either I cannot hear what's happening in the room or I can't, uh, or like people cannot hear me anyway.
Well, this is working for me.
Okay, thanks.
2 minutes. All right. Anyone want to confirm that you're looking at the title page that says Buck Sessions Deep Dive?
Yes.
Confirmed.
All right, we passed the 3 p.m. threshold. If this is more or less as big as the group gets, amazing. We have more interaction, but there were a lot of acceptances. So I will idle a little bit in going through the first couple of slides. Folks will pop in and we will push on along. I can see my chat, by the way. So maybe one note is that I will take a look at the chat every now and then, maybe every 15 minutes, stop and see if there are some big questions or things to pause and address. But I'm also happy to be interrupted out loud if there's a time that we should stop and discuss anything together. So we are on January 22nd at the second Bucks Hub session into how to integrate and apply UX to MCC's work. And the way we've divided this up is that last week we did the overview. We're also going to go into deep dives, getting real practical and nitty-gritty about how you use these methods. So apologies if you weren't able to make it last week. We did send out the recording and the materials. It was much more about the fundamentals of what is UX and how can it help us. So I will gloss over that in 3 or 4 minutes, just in case anyone missed it. And then we're going to dive into what it actually looks like to deploy these tools for research. And coming up next week, a very exciting session on identifying and testing and designing for user assumptions, which will be jointly led with M&E. And later on, probably much later this summer, we'll go into more deep dives. Today, we're just scratching the surface of what the research looks like, but there's lots to learn and apply about how to develop projects with UX design and how to prototype them with people in the real world. And if I can manage the timing right, we'll pause for questions periodically. Maybe we'll even have 5 minutes at the end for a final Q&A. We should finish in the hour. The agenda, I think I just went through, but there's really 2 portions here after the intro, which is some cross-cutting considerations that it's worth us thinking about for whatever method, whatever types of engagement that you've got with the Bucks on a project and activity. These are just some practicalities we should think through. And then we'll talk about specifically for the 3 methods we selected: immersive observation, journey maps, and user personas, when you would use them, why you would use them, how to integrate them at various moments of a development or compact lifecycle, how you get the best data, and maybe a little bit of practice. So yeah, we will do, by the end, you should start thinking about hopefully how to apply UX research to current projects. And I'll just say that we got so many great responses and emails last week after the session, kind of inviting us to think through how we could work on teams. If you have those ideas, you'll know how to contact us. So in the interest of time, don't go to Menti. I'm going to put this back up at the end of the session. But in order to build the most helpful upcoming sessions, we'll ask for you to complete a Menti poll on what sounds most interesting. Lastly, some guiding questions for us all to have in mind. Please think about how these methods might add or change anything about current approaches. If they don't, amazing. You've been doing it all along and we should learn from you. Please think about also, we'll talk a lot about when any of these methods are going to be most helpful or likely to add value. And a huge question, not like we'll answer it, but we'll talk about it, is how we can make sure that whenever we do this, it complements everything we're doing with stakeholder engagement and doesn't become duplicative or especially annoying or troublesome for users. All right, so 3 slides to summarize what UX consists of. This first one is about the understanding, the developing, and the prototyping as phases. These are the way that we introduced the 3 tasks that UX can do for us back in, I guess it was last September or August, when we did a first overview with the OPM lab for all staff. You will see that these are not perfectly sequential, and you may already know that design thinking is intended to have a lot of feedback loops. So although today's focus is on how to understand users, of course, the same methods we're talking about can get you a head start on how to develop projects. I guess the real takeaway, if you're going to have just one from this, is that we don't believe you can develop anything good for people without understanding the purpose it serves for them. So what are understanding methods all about? This was flashed on the screen last week as well. Can't repeat it enough. Gaining insight into what people need and how they will interact with our investments in the real world. What is a user? This also was sort of one of the anchor slides of that very first Intro to UX presentation we gave. It's anyone whose influence or actions can determine whether the solution works as intended. And here, each level of user has unique expertise into what the project is going to need to succeed. We have 2 guiding questions. that we want to ask about each of these levels. So governings at the ministry level, where we do a lot of engagement already, all the way down to whoever is going to actually be writing down the road that we build or using the seeds and irrigation systems that we fund. First is you want to think about the input that you need from that group. And that input can be about what do they want, what's feasible. It can be about, what's been tried before and worked and hasn't and why. The other question is what actions we're going to need each group to take to support the solution. And that can get into what you may know our group is doing more of, social and behavior change. And if we're going to need to think about programs that are going to stimulate and drive certain behavioral changes for a project to work. Some rules of thumb here, by the way, is that you shouldn't expect that users at one level, say administrative, are going to know much beyond their layer. Maybe they do, great. But as a safeguard, user research is here to say that end user perspectives are often underrepresented, and we kind of want to bring the line of inquiry down toward the bottom of this pyramid. Okay, that's the overview. Now we know what UX research is and who the users are. How does UX show up at different moments in MCC compact life cycles? So the Bucks team can and should play very different roles depending on when we get engaged. And I hope it's pretty clear that each of these steps builds on previous learnings, meaning it's a lot easier to be helpful later on if we're involved earlier on. So at the start, in CA and RCA stage, understanding people is fundamentally about understanding what problem we are solving for them. Only later do we want to get more precise about, okay, so how does that problem manifest in people's lives? What does a solution even look like? Even later, when we're getting, farther down toward, final IM and concept note, well, much further than concept notes, but presenting things that we might want to fund, we might want to start testing our solutions with real people before we commit to what we're going to do. And then at the last stage, final stages into implementation, we want to keep in touch with people. UX can help us stay engaged with the users who are implicated to understand what's working, what's not, and maybe whether we could tweak anything. And I'm throwing this here at the beginning because we're going to use this framework to talk through what happens actually when it comes to a method in each stage, with the big disclaimer that sometimes you're pursuing multiple goals at once, right? So you can apply a method that is both about problem definition and solution development, and that is perfectly fine. This is an oversimplified framework because that's what they're for. All right, so we get a lot of questions. In fact, we got great questions last week about the difference between UX research and stakeholder engagement. So here are just a few core distinctions between these two processes as they typically happen at MCC. At the top, they both very much have the goal of increasing the chances of project success and adoption. I think it's also fair to say that sometimes the way we do stakeholder engagement actually encompasses a lot of UX style thinking, but our experience is that is neither always nor usually the case. So if we look at focus, stakeholder engagement, we know that we're trying to understand and address the needs of anybody who's going to be impacted or is going to influence the project. UX research and design takes a slightly different approach, which is like, if you're doing it at the extreme, you won't even be designing projects until you've started thinking of what does this do for the needs, wants, and challenges of end users. And who it includes is a little bit different as well. Sometimes stakeholder engagement goes all the way down past community representatives into end users, but UX research is almost certainly going to include the everyday people who will interact with the product or program we put out. The goals, I think, are also an interesting highlight, an interesting difference to highlight, we'll say, where maybe you've already got the project in mind, right? The government knows that it wants to do something. There's so much evidence. There's great evidence from so many sectors about why it can be useful. And the reason you do stakeholder engagement is really to get buy-in and mitigate risks. Whereas the goal, fundamental UX research and design, is to make all solutions drive from needs that users say are their priorities and their biggest pain points. And then the hallmark methods vary a bit, which we're going to get into, of course, today. And I'm going to get ready for a doozy of a next slide. Bear with me. It isn't meant to be a discussion slide. The point of this is to show imperfectly that we know, of course, sector leads are engaging stakeholders all through the compact life cycle. And given that, I want to leave everyone with a big question about how to fit UX and the Bucks unit into that process. So the details I'm going to click through came from an internal synthesis conducted in 2023, I believe, by Monica Tejada and Hina, where they got input from representatives in each of these units about what are your requirements, what are your practices for stakeholder engagement. And thanks to Paige and Marie Beatriz and Ann Pizer, I've gotten some more details, which can help us sort of break down what engagement looks like. So you've got these solid blocks where you're interacting with people in the country. You've got these dotted line blocks where the team, the MCC and CDT and MCA team, is building the kind of guidance about how that interaction will go. And then you've got these solid line blocks that are a little bit lighter, that these are just the official plans. They will dictate our policies of how we engage with people. And there's a lot of it, right? So ESP does this continuously, starting in development, all the way through implementation and closeout. GSI, of course, has, according to the gender policy, a requirement for inclusive consultations, and specifically to increase the input of diverse stakeholders. So there's a lot of overlap with what Bucks does there. You got EA super early on with the goal of stakeholder engagement to fill in the gaps of the existing CA, which is going to help us prioritize and identify constraints. And no one's working in isolation here. We know this. EA is working with FIT, working with GSI and the whole team to really understand sort of how the stakeholders are mapped and influence constraints. And M&E, personally, I would say is really interesting because before AIF, you know, the staff have comparatively fewer in-person interactions with end users and community members. A lot of the plans are informed by research produced elsewhere, but later on, there's tons of interaction for the sake of evaluation. And I think I'll just highlight that the 2023 analysis surfaced a few cross-cutting issues that we want to be sensitive to. One is consultation fatigue. One is a lack of a centralized record of learnings. 3 is a lack of time in the detailed consultations early on. And 4 is that it's often harder to get smaller stakeholders to participate, and in particular excluded groups. So the guiding question for everyone at Bucks to figure out how can we complement this is, when can UX insights synthesize or deepen stakeholder engagement, in particular to guide planning decisions? I'm just going to pause because that's a lot. And as I move on, I'm just going to take for granted that this is the question that we'll all have in mind. Any comments here? Okay. I don't see any. So, what does it mean to incorporate UX questions? It certainly doesn't mean that you add someone from Bucks to the team and they are responsible for it. Absolutely not. The research and design that is about users is a collective effort, and tasks are split across the team. So this is one way it can work. With the MCC leads here in blue, the MCA here in these red. You've got, of course, our consultants that we can see in the gray bubbles here. And how do they all connect back to the users? So I'll walk through just a few of the main roles. When it comes to the Bucks Hub team member, we're here to advise on what are really important user questions that you might need to understand better to have a good program logic and to have great plans in place. The project lead has been often sort of the anchor who helps us coordinate UX work with the rest of the team. But all technical leads are there to identify ways that these might help program design. You know, when it's beyond the expertise or scope of the consultants that you're bringing on yourself, say in GSI or anywhere, we can think about the kind of behavioral researchers that will be useful. And they're useful specifically for filtering these insights back through to TORs and project plans. We often hire a consultant. We have a couple of resources that we use over and over again. FHI 360 are excellent researchers who manage in-country UX research. They'll bring us back recommendations based on what we think we want to do and how that aligns with what people's reality is and what they need. We also work with Donna Sherrard at Changeable, who does a lot of this, especially on the higher level engagement and facilitation for us. And at the end of the day, if it all works right, this filters through to how the government delivers services and how our plans are ultimately implemented. It doesn't look the same on every team, by the way. Here we show that there is a social behavior change or a Bucks team member, for instance, on the MCA side. Sometimes that is the case, but there's a lot of different models. I don't know if Allison or Mitzi have any ideas about sort of when this has worked really well in terms of defining team roles, or when it's been confusing. So we can talk about how to avoid that. Take any input here.
I don't know if Alison is gonna come through, Taylor, but what I can add is that, you know, regardless of the modality in which behavior user experience of Bucks Hub member joins the team, what we have found that is very useful in enhancing the effectiveness of that support is to bring in that Bucks member to those key meetings and conversations so that the person has a full understanding of the context, the team, the situation. Otherwise, it's very challenging for any of you and the Bucks member to operate a little bit in a vacuum without understanding a little bit the teams, the needs of and personalities of the teams, and the actual context and situation in which you'll be operating. So that's the only thing I will add. But I don't know if Alison or Mitzi, from their own experience, they want to add something else.
Thanks, Damiana.
No, that's really helpful, Damiana and Taylor. Thank you. I would just add that I think it's important when we are in the process of developing the org chart for the MCA, of thinking how best we can serve user needs by incorporating that role appropriately at the MCA as well. Is that a shared role for someone who's tasked with behavior change and user experience with another role as well? Or is that an SBC specialist or a manager, a director? Just thinking through what it is that's actually needed that will help the work be effective and sustainable.
Perfect. Great. So that's something that we figure out together when we have a conversation about how Bucks can contribute to a team. And then the last of these cross-cutting considerations is, what does it mean once you have all of the user insights? Like, now that you know something, what do you do with that knowledge? And you might say that it can fall into three categories here. So this whole slide is for technical leads to get a better sense of how do we turn our insights into concrete choices and plans. We learn something about people. It gets taken into account into things that inform design choices, things that inform how we implement, and it can be informing how we measure our success. The deliverable from the UX vendor can take a lot of different forms. Usually it's a report, we'll have a presentation. It could be a database of pain points. It could be jobs to be done. We'll agree on that up front. But we'll work with sector leads to basically find the most useful form for this knowledge to take. And then we use it as guidance for, okay, what does this mean for design contractors? What does this mean maybe for the priority people that we're targeting? What does this mean for what an actual successful project delivers to people? It also can inform partnership agreements. You might need to know things about, the capabilities of who the MCA is going to be working with. And sequence of service delivery, I think, is a really interesting one. Just making sure that you're not skipping over any important steps that are essential for bringing people who will determine the success of a program into it in the right way. And we are having great conversations with M&E, and we want to keep having more. We will be about how these insights might even inform the project success metrics, the ERRs, and the indicators that we track. All right. So, apologies for the build slide. This is something from the last session. I'm just going to click all the way through it and not repeat the details because we talked about it. This is to say that when you're choosing a method, you want something that lets you fill the gap between what you already know and what you need to know. I'm going to open to the group. Type it in the chat or shout it out. Which of these types of methods do you believe best lend themselves to understanding users as compared to developing projects or prototyping?
Only one?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Nice, contextual. Nice. Okay, you can keep throwing in ideas. Very much agree with both of the top two. I think a rule of thumb is that closer to the top, you're going to get closer to understanding basic needs and user behaviors. Closer to the bottom, you need to have understood things before you actually go into evaluating whether solutions will work. So there we are. Now let's go into these. This is the flow of the rest of the section. We're going to start with immersive observation. Thanks for the contributions. When would we do this? So with the example of being able to get out into the field and do up the kind of observation that you'll hire an anthropologist or a sociologist to do, you're collecting contextual data about people in their natural environment. You're paying attention to their actions, behaviors, their triggers, their frustrations, and very, very importantly, their interactions. These things are so hard to know when all you're getting are conversations via a workshop or via a survey, answers via survey. So what is observation especially good at? It's good for real world nuance and context. This could come across early or later in the process. Like early, maybe you're still building hypotheses about the drivers of certain behaviors, and you want to avoid excluding potential explanations by narrowing in too much, say via a survey. And later, maybe you want to see the most realistic way people are going to respond to something you introduced. And there's labs, there are highly controlled experiments, and they will teach us something, but they will also necessarily distort the behavioral response that people have. So this is about observing people in their real natural environment, which leads us to greater objectivity, hopefully. There's another thing that's really important, and this is the third line about noticing what subjects don't. A lot of people just take their choices and actions for granted. There's so many times when you'll ask someone a question about why they do something and they don't know, they haven't reflected, or they're too close to the decision to really understand why. So you've got this nice little overlap of UX researchers, just like the Backstreet Boys and 4-year-olds, who are always asking further, why are things happening? This is an example here about strengthening health services delivery in Lesotho. So they renovated health centers around the country. And I can imagine in this case, because the setting is going to be so influential on behaviors and how people receive these investments, that being there to observe is kind of a non-negotiable. You've got to go through it. Okay. So what would that mean early on? Starting with a CA, observation at the beginning would be looking for how do people experience constraints. So in the Zambia Farm to Market project, which I'm a part of right now, what we could have used observation for early on, and we may still, is literally looking at what happens during the commute to market. We know that they've identified getting goods to market as a key constraint, but why? How is that going through? How do people prepare for the market? What do the transactions look like? Maybe what kind of information asymmetries are there when it happens in terms of either finding transit or deciding what goods to bring and to what sites, or even negotiating prices. All of these things are really ripe for observation. And this is the kind of output that we might get from them. So if we know how this constraint manifests for people, we can have a systematic routines analysis, and we can organize it by pain points. Pain points is a word that UX researchers use over and over and over again because it's what are we going to solve for folks? It'll come up again in the journey maps. And to that point, we often combine methods. Observation and journey maps can work really well together. Oh, this is also a great way to inform stakeholder mapping. I can think of conversations in workshops where really well-informed stakeholders are talking us through all of the different people that they work with, say to set a policy or put something into place. And then sometimes you just forget that there's a really important player. Like I'm honestly thinking of sort of administrative support whose involvement can be really critical to whether something goes through well. And I would say this is something that you might want to do before finishing an ESHA, before finishing an RCA. And we can think about other items that's like formal plans that could benefit from this. Okay. I wrote myself a couple notes here, is that this is all about striking a balance between the openness to the unknown and having really focused research aims. So when you are doing observation, you will necessarily be open to things that you didn't expect to see. And part of what we work really carefully on is trying to figure out this is relevant and we want to bring it back versus this is interesting, but it's not going to inform our design. And the other note I have here is that good recruitment is really crucial. You need to understand how you want to break people down for observation based on their attitudes, their life experiences, their behaviors. Do we want extreme users? And that's what makes you get the best data. So then, say we've moved on, early concept development. We're looking for more specific needs to address. Now, you're painting in broad brushstrokes. You want to know what the investment should achieve for people. So what's a good journey and what's a bad journey? You can set out to specifically map the differences in each of those. It can be really useful for talking about, well, we want to drive toward this, and this is the key variable that ends in success for someone. Workarounds, they're huge. What are people doing that are the kind of life hacks that make something quicker or more efficient for them, that make something honestly more comfortable or more convenient? I mentioned extreme users earlier, so sometimes they're called marginal users. It's a great idea sometimes to seek them out specifically as the kind of people who just seem to have it easier or who seem to have it really hard if they're going to be involved in, if they're going to be someone that we're solving for. Like, what are they doing differently, for instance? Um, yeah, I'm just going to say this is a good time also to bring other stakeholders, so MCA leads and maybe government leads who will be implementing into the field with you, because there's no better substitute than firsthand experience for really getting a sense of how things impact people. The outputs can look like these things. Jobs to be done is something that is a really pretty structured and common framework for defining what is a good solution do for people. I haven't seen it used or termed in this way at MCC very much, but the principle can apply. That can be the output of the kind of observation at this stage. And this is getting into things like the JDD or CDMs. I would think about these are the right questions to ask before those. All right. I admit that this is outside of this session's title, which is understanding and not developing, but it's relevant. So I'm going to quickly just say that during design and validation, observation is great for ways to avert potential confusion or discomfort. You can start looking for how people are actually approaching anything that we've introduced. You start thinking about the questions that they have about why is it happening this way? Or how do I use this? If we've introduced new technology into the field, there will be questions and we need to know what they are. You can start listening for the conversations that folks are having. A lot of times, the word of mouth is going to be the biggest influence on how people actually perceive or adopt or interact with whatever it is we put out there. So how are they talking about it with each other? And you can get early hints, some early signals about what is this going to change for folks, especially if it is adding any new costs or inconveniences for people. That's a great sign that even early in implementation, we can try to course correct to make our programs and activities more palatable. I chose this pick randomly because I thought, this could be an example of an infrastructure project where our goal is to avoid people walking on the train tracks because trains will be coming through. And it would be very easy to just test putting up signage and seeing, does that actually change where people walk? Or is it going to take something more than that? These are examples of outputs. And at this point, we're getting a lot more detailed. We're much further along than what goes into an IM or compact. We're talking about TORs for whoever is going to be executing the project. And during implementation, you don't have much room. We maybe not have any room to adjust program design, but we can still think about whether there are opportunities to tweak certain components. So there are a lot of examples, I'm sure this group could throw them out, about learning that we need additional resources, maybe staff, maybe budget, to execute on our project. An observation can play a really helpful role in monitoring sort of what's happening with the managers, what's happening with the people who are putting the project in place. And maybe why are some places getting better results than others? What's causing these delays? This is something that I know the teams are doing already, but we can come in and we can do very specific, just sort of targeted analysis of why we're seeing the early results that we see, especially when they do not match what we expected to see. And the kind of guidance that can offer at the time is maybe ways to socialize. Maybe it's about communicating what our projects are actually about, what steps people need to take, the kind of prerequisites that will turn a utility investment into something people can actually use in their homes. Did we miss something that they need to do? It's a gap analysis, you could call. And yeah, at that stage, we're not changing formal contracts and plans, but we might be changing communications or guidance to our vendors. All right. So my pro tips for how to get great data is to never take anything you see for granted. Over here, just you should expect that qualitative observational data, it's always about a representative sample. We're not talking large sample sizes. It's not big data. It's about really rich descriptions of what's happening. It can always complement quant data. And in fact, I think there's many cases where it should. But you'll get evocative quotes that help people understand a story instead of stats and summaries. It's understanding why, not understanding exactly how much and exactly how often. But yeah, I think these are actually really, really complementary, and MCC is brilliant at quant. This is one way to be a little smarter at qual. How would you think? You think like a spy, you think like a 5-year-old, you never stop asking why. What you're looking for, it is the one of the few methods where you're really looking for things visibly. So social interactions is huge. Also unintuitive choices. Your best researchers are going to spot something that feels like, wait, why is that happening? And then make sure to ask questions about it. Always will be asking about frustrations, pain points, and people's questions. People's questions are a great guide to things that we can make easier for them. There's documentation resources we have. One is the AEIOU sheet. This is what gets documented. This is the kind of thing that leads to insights, activities, environments, interactions, objects, and users. And then there's a lot about the tone that you need to take for this to be valuable. You're never there to judge. People need space. This takes time. People tend to perform if they know they're being observed. And the whole point is to sort of remove that feeling from them. So researchers should never wear suits. They're there to kind of blend into the environment as much as possible. Tips for not being obnoxious in your contextual asking of why. Yeah, everyone has a different approach and style when they're doing this in the field, right? So some of the things that, I don't know, I would say over and over again would be like, oh, that's so fascinating. Like, how did you come up with that? Or, giving a little compliment that helps somebody think that you're trying to learn from, because you are legitimately trying to learn from them. A little, "Oh, tell me more. What is that all about? Have you ever tried anything different?" There's a lot of roundabout ways to get through why. Okay. And this is a practice worksheet that anyone can use in the team to prepare you to observe well in the field. There was a great question last week about when this should happen through formal professional research that we can help commission, and when it can just happen in an afternoon on a mission where the team is in the country and there's a way for you to go and learn. So I would just say it would be helpful to think about this before any TDYs, and imagine and just talk the team through these questions. I don't know if anyone wants to contribute, because we're going to move to the next method in just a second, about an example project you think observation might be really helpful. Okay, I have one. And I won't. Oh, Joelle, yes, please.
Wait, no, it's not an example. It's actually a question. So I think you should go first.
Okay. I don't need to name the country, but we're interested in learning about what is it that will attract youth to growing job sectors somewhere? What is maybe the mismatch between the supply of jobs in a country and youth's demand for it? Because they're finding there's too much immigration and there is a brain drain. I love using observation when you're talking about youth because there's so many things that they are taking for granted about choices and preferences, and influences that guide them to want a certain kind of job. That's very hard to get if we're just doing interviews and focus groups. But over the course of time, if you're seeing sort of how do they interact with people, who is giving them a source of inspiration throughout their day, throughout their week, there's a lot to be learned that they just would never be able to reveal, youth and children especially. Yeah, what is your question?
My question was about the role of observation in a situation where like you're introducing something new, right? So if you're observing people in a natural habitat and then say like they don't have electricity and they're just going about their business and you're trying to understand like how they might use electricity, but then electricity is not something that's part of the natural habitat, like how do you make the transition between those things?
Yes. So sometimes you actually would concoct an experiment which takes us out of the natural habitat, like you said. It's a bit of a trade-off. Um, but there's other ways, right? If you think about what environments do they encounter where electricity happens, and sort of what questions do they have about, say they were put in responsibility for, electricity at a church, or sorry, not electricity, but running something at a church. How would they think about the questions that they've got, given that they're not always around those tools? Um, or in someone else's home, you could have social interactions where you would sort of like pose those little interventions to them. Uh, there's also trying to find the best proxy you can. So if it's not electricity through a power line, maybe it's at least like lights being on. And so you want to observe someone at home when they've got lights on, when they've got lights off. Or you use daytime, nighttime as a proxy for showing how behaviors change over those. Basically, look for the next closest thing or throw in an intervention. Um, cool.
And Taylor, I'm sorry, it's just as a clarification for me. So observation, maybe, is it a method that is better suited to more like understand the problems, the barriers, and sort of maybe, as you said, the aspirations and the needs of the people? And then maybe observation it's a method, but maybe it's not the method to test, pilot test, or prototype. Like you will move to a different method once you want to say how they're going to interact with a new product or something that they haven't used before. So in your example for Joella, it's like, oh, you could take them to outside of their natural environment where they can actually interact with something. But like, are you still observing them or are you doing something else besides observation?
Yeah. It wouldn't be strictly, I'm looking at Allison's picture. You're not talking about like good old ethnographic observation at that point. It's still observation though. You put yourself in a situation where you see how someone interacts with things. If it's contrived, it's more in the prototyping stage. The same approach, however, can be used to just notice the relevant interactions. I ran out of time as always. Mitzi and then Ginny, and then I'm gonna move on.
Sure. I was just thinking, I haven't done this at MCC, but I was thinking observation for like transportation around schools. You might see where children walk normally, where the crossing is that they usually take, kind of groupings of children, and that would guide you in the design of, how to put roads there so that it would not, taking in mind their usual paths and where people congregate, kind of how you might put safety measures in,
Yes,
based on what they're doing currently.
thanks, Ginny.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's less about like the type of project and more if you're concerned that there may be recall bias, or people may be misreporting sort of what their own behavior, or even more just not aware of what their actual behavior is, right? It's hard. So your example of kids is a good one, because kids can't often articulate, what in a what their response might be. So it would be easier to observe their behavior. Another thing is, like, if it's sort of sensitive information, if there's like, intermarriage problems, for example, like just observing, like if uh like every woman in the US, or at least in the DC area, when you go in to have OB appointments or go give birth, they immediately separate you from your husband or spouse to ask you if you feel safe. And that's a way of sort of observing your behavior, as if it's different or not when that person is in the room. And it's just like a checkpoint that we've like put in, because it's an easy way to observe that for a pregnant person. So that's just like an example. I can't think of like a better one, but where someone might not be able to be completely forthright, or may just like not even be aware of their own like changes in behavior. It's easier to observe instead of just ask them outright.
Awesome. Okay. Catherine, quick answer. Especially, let's keep in transportation. I've done observation in terms of mobility to figure out what confuses people about where they're going and how can they get there with less frustration. And signage is a great one. You see how someone interacts with signs. Do they totally ignore it? Do they look at it and take it actually to mean the opposite of what it's supposed to mean? I live in New York, and that happens a lot with subway signaling. So, yeah, how do they look at the things around them to guide what they do? Journey maps. Okay. At their core, journey maps are helpful, structured templates to take notes about experience unfolds. It's all about breaking something pretty complex into the phases and the steps, and then dissecting what is going on at each moment. And the variables, the building blocks of a journey map, are completely up to you. We'll talk about some of the really common ones. This is really good for visual communication. It's really good to isolate what are the best opportunities where you can really make a difference, because that's where someone is struggling most. It's also super helpful to clarify what are the user choices and actions, as opposed to the things that are outside of their control. And this is great anytime we have to set something up that has to do with behavior change. And this is one I think we're more familiar with at MCC. So we've got examples here that are inspiring these questions from the Lesotho Horticulture Project. And the RCA journey maps are going to be about, how do people experience constraints? What steps does a farmer go through to join a co-op? What initial appeal does that co-op hold for people? It's very early on in terms of not just what are the obstacles that might keep them from going through a process, but what are the drivers as well. And there's one important step that is about defining the start and end points of a journey. This is going to help the team think about the objective. Are we caring more about whether we should smooth the journey toward the same endpoint, or actually are we trying to reroute someone's journey or extend their journey to a new goal? And I'm just going to go through these quickly, because I think there'll be a lot of the same MCC specific items informed by these kinds of questions by phase. All right. So yeah, along with laying out all of the steps, the further we go along, we're focusing more on what facilitates or hinders movement through a journey. You pinpoint obstacles. Later, these might be really good signals for risks that project managers look out for. If you see a barrier happening, like group conflict here, do we intervene? Do we worry? Do we talk to the manager here? And on the flip side, the facilitators they might be the kind of thing that we could track as process indicators that things are going well. As a tie-in to the final method we'll get to in a minute, is that it can be very, very helpful to compare the journeys of different users. This can reveal why it's easier for some than for others. And in Lesotho, they in fact did that. They had different journey maps for a few different user personas. This is the stage of what you might create and what it might inform. All right, I'm throwing up the term design principles because it is forever repeated in the world of UX. It basically means the same thing here as what to emphasize at this stage. Once you know what's going on at any step of a journey, what does that mean for you? It's a set of guidance for project planners to make sure that the service and the messaging is speaking to the needs of the users at the moment that they reach them. So at this point, journey maps are giving us unique insight into exactly what we do. And it could be based exactly on the timeline that the compact goes through. It could also help us reveal, sort of understand where someone is on the journey and how likely they are to move along it. And finally, during implementation, we need to be really transparent about whether it's possible to tweak certain components. You could always revisit journey maps as an exercise in reporting or even early evaluation to see, are we moving from the baseline journey or are we going through all the same hiccups? So basically, yes, I think journey maps as a baseline evaluation can be really useful to give you a sense of when you're monitoring later, are things changing a little bit before you even get into the formal evaluation? And of course, identifying sources of delay, specifically where do they lie and what are they attributed to? So I'm going to go straight into the tips for how to get great data in a journey map. And it's paying attention to detail, not shying away from detail. Think about all the variables in play. There's so many metaphors we come up with. I love video games. So if we have our users and they're our heroes and we are trying to guide them to winning a stage, like these are all of the things you need to figure out. Like, what are their questions? What's getting in their way? What are they even in control of? You know, what controls can they wield? What tools? And games today are so much more complex than early Mario, but you can think about all of the forces that might influence whether or not they're able to cross all of these obstacles. And our job as the behind the scenes designers is to make the journey such that they know how to move through it and get where they want to be. Really wanted to do this. But again, I'm going to move on so we can at least say what personas are. I will say, if this is a template that I'll share with everyone, where you can think about some key components of a journey map. The basics would be is a user doing, who is actually involved, what are the pain points, and what opportunities do we have to improve them. What makes something a useful pain point? You really want to try to break it down into a distinct issue to address. So, you know, if I'm looking for something here where it says it's a challenge for POCs to coordinate everyone's dates when it comes to preparing a travel authorization, like go further. Is it about the dates changing at the last minute or unclear communication about when something is supposed to happen, or are there competing team priorities? Another good sign of cohesive, comprehensive pain points is that they have multiple perspectives highlighted. So here in the actors involved, you know, you've got the traveler's family, for instance. Maybe that's not a problem we care about solving. That's totally acceptable. But doing this in a rigorous way will require that we include that as something we know is affected by our project. And at least we're going to get that data on the page and be clear what's a priority for us to solve for and what is not. And then the big note about what's a good opportunity is it responds to a pain point, right? There's all sorts of reasons why you might believe it is going to work, more likely to work, but we never want an opportunity that doesn't actually correspond to a problem people have. I'm debating whether to open for questions. I'm not going to. If you have them, put them in the chat. Personas are really interesting, and I think we could make a lot better use of them. They are especially good at building empathy with the end user, and preventing a one-size-fits-all approach, because often a one size does not fit all. Customization necessarily makes our projects more complex and harder to manage. So there are a ton of questions about the trade-offs between complexity when it comes to tailored approaches for users and just efficient project design. User profiles can give you a really good measure about whether that's going to matter down the line. And in addition to prioritizing which users you might address or how you might implement services differently for each one, personas can give you ideas for the roles that different users might play in implementation. For instance, some might be catalysts or ambassadors to help bridge adoption for communicators. Philosophically, personas are a recognition that strict demographics are rarely the things that best define people. And this is an image here from a health project that I found outside. I can give more details on where it came from, but they're flagging the traits that actually matter more in terms of one's health practices and one's needs. And maybe, and often, there are correlations between traits like challenges, values, digital capacity, family structure, and gender, age, location. But a UX researcher will not take that for granted. Okay. Hopefully some folks can wait an extra 5 minutes. So during root cause analysis, the focus should be on how do social and behavioral realities contribute to constraints. We're going to be asking questions about who might gain the most from an MCC intervention. And it's always the case that some people will benefit more from MCC programs than others. We can imagine personas to be a tool that helps us set expectations early and honestly about what that's going to be. It might not make the judgment calls easier, but it can provide a lot of transparency into our decision-making process around how we expect the benefits of our programs to play out. We're asking about, the interests and the norms and the expectations of key users. So is this similar? And then once you get some background on people, that's when you shift into matchmaking their goals and needs to opportunities. So I've got several examples. This is just one, Carl, this was for, I think, a project around whether farmers would adopt new technology. And there's a good bit of flexibility in that you could refine personas and you can, sorry, I'm just going to back up. What you want to do is think about what success looks like for various users and what that will enable them to do. So come back to this blue question at the top of the slide whenever you're trying to just be guided at a high level. So in addition to, what are they struggling with? Like, what are they trying to achieve and what will a good solution look like for them? And you can break it out by different user. You might find that the solution that works for half the personas that we build is not the solution that we're going to deliver. And that could mean that we aren't going to focus on that whole population. It helps us figure out who's the most important beneficiary groups. And I'm just going to see if I can get to a couple of final main comments. During design and validation, personas are going to help teams decide what kind of options to offer to whom. This is where you could combine personas with, say, an A/B test, something that experiments with a couple of different solution routes. And you can gauge, does one solution work better for a different persona type? very important not to be too complicated here, but for instance, this little example from a Feed the Future project ended up finding that for some of the users, an AI chatbot was going to be the best possible thing for them to interact with. And for others, it was going to be an extension agent. And by knowing how to route people, you're not going to frustrate them or lose them through the process. And finally, at the stage of implementation, you can imagine using personas both to understand what's working and also to drive conversion and adoption rates even further. We can see whether or not persona traits are influencing the relative impact for different populations. Sort of in the same way as a journey map, I think if you've got good personas early on, they can become a red thread to help us understand early results that we see very, very early in implementation. That does mean that you will need to assign persona traits to individuals, which is complicated but possible two ways. One is if we're talking about any digital service, you can literally organize users by persona activity and monitor it that way. That's not a lot of MCC projects though. So another way is if we're doing an early survey, we can use upfront questions to filter respondents into our personas and then look for the correlations between that and their opinions and behaviors. And then this is simply one way to talk about the key variables that should go into a persona card. Because it's 402, I'm going to skip past it. I hope it's a little bit more straightforward, but we'll share out all of these questions, and they're the kinds of things that you want to ask early on. As a recap, there's a summary of what each of these do in terms of understanding a problem, in terms of each phase of compact development, how you would use them. And there's a recap of when and why to use these three methods if you're thinking about whether they're going to be valuable for your project and development. And I will do a final thing for whoever can stay and say goodbye to whoever cannot, which is to ask you to go to Menti and give any input into what you'd love to hear about most on future sessions, and then open it up to questions.
And
Thank
Taylor,
you.
just like last time, if you can type the Menti link into the chat, because
Yep.
at least on my interface, I cannot click it.
Yep, got you. And this has been a really busy week in MCC and in the government. So thank you for joining at all. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Taylor.
Yes, thanks, Taylor.
Thank you.